bringing together voices in child and youth healthcare. This is CAFC Presents.
CAFC would like to thank the following member organizations for their generous support of our knowledge translation activities: the IWK Health Centre, the Children's Health Foundation of London, McMaster Children's Hospital Foundation, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario Research Institute, the Children's Hospital Foundation of Manitoba, the Montreal Children's Hospital Foundation, the Holland Bloorview Children's Rehabilitation Hospital Foundation, the Children's Hospital Foundation of Saskatchewan, and Trillium Health Partners. We would also like to thank the following Keystone and program partners for their ongoing contributions that support all of CAFC's programs and activities. If you have any questions or comments for our panelists, please type them into the question box at any time during the presentation. You can also share your thoughts and questions on Twitter by tagging @CAFCTweets and using the hashtag CAFCPresents. All of our webinars are recorded and can be found on the CAFC Knowledge Exchange Network. Use the CAN to share these recordings with your colleagues or register an account and post comments, links, or other resources that you think will be of interest. And be sure to sign up for the CAFC Presents weekly email newsletter to stay up to date with upcoming webinars and our recorded webinar archive.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of CAFC Presents. My name is Doug Maynard, and I'm the Associate Director at CAFC, the Canadian Association of Pediatric Health Centres. And today's webinar is titled Timely Autism Diagnosis, Considerations Across the Lifespan. And once again, I'd like to thank and welcome Dr. Gail Andrew from the Glen Rose Rehab Hospital in Edmonton, who helped bring this, who's joining me today as our co-host, and helped bring this topic to our CAFC Presents stage. I think it's been it's fair to say it's been years that she's been promising to get Dr. Lonnie Zwagenbaum to do a presentation for us, but we finally have him here, so we won't fault her for taking quite so long. But it's going to be a great presentation, as he really is a recognized expert in most things autism, I think, according to many across Canada would agree with that. So our presenter today is Dr. Lonnie Zwagenbaum, who's a developmental pediatrician and site lead for child health at the Glen Rose Rehabilitation Hospital in Edmonton, where he also co-directs the Autism Research Centre. He holds the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation Chair in Autism Research and is a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Alberta, where his research focuses on early behavioural and biological markers and developmental trajectories in children and youth with autism spectrum disorder. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Gail Andrew as the co-host to today's presentation, and to hand the virtual podium over to Dr. Lonnie Zwagenbaum at the Glen Rose Rehabilitation Hospital in Edmonton. Over to you.
Terrific. So thanks very much, Doug, and thanks to Ann Hawkins as well, and Gail, of course, for organizing the webinar. I'm delighted to participate in this today. The topic is on timely diagnosis of ASD. There'll definitely be a focus on early diagnosis, but also recognizing the diversity in this condition. There's no question that some individuals would be diagnosed later, so it really does become an issue of timely diagnosis across the lifespan. So looking forward to the conversation today. There are kind of a few sections of the presentation, so there'll be some natural points to take a couple questions, and so I'll try to make sure that I'm efficient with my time to leave lots of time for discussion. So as Doug suggested, certainly if people have questions, go ahead and type them in, and we'll have some discussion throughout the presentation. Okay. So there genuinely is increasing recognition of autism as a lifespan condition, an incredibly diverse condition. And the autism that at least that I learned about in medical school and during residency is very different in terms of the diversity and continuum that we see today. Whereas in the past, autism was almost invariably associated with intellectual disability, now it's actually a minority of individuals with autism who have intellectual disability, and most, in fact, are highly verbal, and intellectual ability varies entirely across the continuum, from people who are significantly challenged to people with exceptional abilities. Autism occurs both in males and females, in boys and girls, and in men and women. The sex ratio has been quite consistent, but there's certainly increased recognition of autism among women, and also recognition that the presentation can be somewhat different, which can lead to delays in diagnosis. In general, there is diversity in autism across the lifespan. So there have been encouraging advances, but also ongoing challenges that I'd like to highlight sort of as we ease into the topic. So, so first, why does age of diagnosis matter? Even among preschoolers, there remains a significant gap between when parents first recognize concerns and the time that the diagnosis is confirmed. And many parents describe a diagnostic odyssey. It's still difficult for parents to feel that they're being heard. As you know, it's very difficult for families to navigate the assessment and service system, and that varies considerably in communities across Canada. And there's a lot at stake, both in terms of allowing parents to have some closure on their concerns and shift their energies, and in particular the opportunity for children to access and participate in diagnosis-specific interventions. So there are some exciting developments. You know, over the past 10 to 15 years, there have been quite significant advances in knowledge regarding early behavioral and biomarkers of autism, pushing the boundaries of early detection. There's actually an exciting neuroimaging study that was just accepted in the journal Nature, looking at brain surface area and suggesting that the trajectory of brain growth, particularly around brain surface area, as early as 6 months, might be able to identify infants at risk, and moves us into this exciting but somewhat uncharted territory of the possibility of pre-symptomatic detection, which I'd like to talk a little bit more about, because it offers opportunities but also raises a number of challenging ethical and clinical issues. The truth is, a lot of this work that is pushing the boundary around early detection and diagnosis is focused on high-risk infants, so often younger siblings of children with autism. And the truth is, these are infants followed at major university centers, sort of highly specialized assessment protocols. And even though there is this exciting possibility of pre-symptomatic detection, there's no question that pre-symptomatic detection is not equivalent to early diagnosis. And the whole nature of thinking about diagnosis in the absence of symptoms and implications for communication with families and offering intervention, I think, is something that requires a lot more thought and discussion. There are genuinely advances in early diagnosis. Even 10 years ago, when I first started work at the Glenrose, there was definitely an uneasiness with considering the diagnosis in kids that were younger than 2 or 2.5 years old. There was a sense that maybe this is a diagnosis that we're more familiar with in somewhat older preschoolers, and maybe it wouldn't really be a reliable or stable diagnosis if we push those boundaries. But there's actually now considerable evidence that if we think about the diagnosis and are confident about making it in infants as young as 18 months, that diagnosis will continue to be confirmed as those infants get older. However, as you know, particularly those who work in diagnostic clinic, that it's not so straightforward. And some kids walk through the door, and even at a very young age, their autism is very apparent. And for other infants and toddlers, things are a lot more subtle. And in particular, differential diagnosis and being confident about diagnosis is a lot more challenging in kids with less severe or prototypic symptoms, and also kids with more advanced intellectual and language development. And it creates a bit of a dilemma, because kids who at the point of diagnosis are more advanced in some of these skills may actually have a more robust response to intervention. But the truth is, it can be difficult to confirm diagnoses in that group. There's also advances in ASD screening. There are screens out there, which we'll talk about, that actually have pretty decent sensitivity and positive predictive value, and arguably do have something to offer that's value add to the excellent observation and surveillance that would take place in community practice. However, as you know, as you follow public discussion in the literature, the truth is that early screening policy, particularly in the United States, is at a bit of an impasse, endorsed by professional societies like the American Academy of Pediatrics, but in fact not by public health organizations. The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force came out with a statement, I think just last year, basically saying that autism screening was not ready for prime time, was not appropriate for community practice in children whose parents had not yet identified concerns, because there weren't clinical trials that confirmed that children who were screened and received a diagnosis on that basis in the long term would do better than kids who were identified through the usual clinical process. There is a Canadian Canadian Task Force for Preventative Health through the Public Health Agency of Canada, who have come out with a pretty strong statement about the absence of evidence to support general developmental screening, but that task force has not specifically addressed autism at this point. So currently, we're in this position of not really having a Canadian position on autism screening. Despite the challenges, there's no question that autism is becoming much more familiar to the broad range of community practitioners. And even though we would like to see kids earlier, we do see, based on systematic reviews, sort of a gradual decrease in the average age of diagnosis, including through the Center for Disease Control in the US. This sort of very modest decrease from 4.5 to, in some studies, just under 4. But the truth is that there are persistent disparities in age of diagnosis, both related to clinical factors like intellectual ability and language, but also related to sociodemographics like socioeconomic status and ethnicity. And I think for those of us who work clinically, we continue to grapple with kids who get referred at later ages. Those kids that tend to fly under the radar at an earlier stage tend to have a more complex presentation, both because the symptoms may be somewhat more subtle, and also because those kids have had a lot more life experience and frustration, and we're less sure about how to make timely diagnoses in those older kids. And the truth is, we don't talk about it quite as much, other than sort of sharing with our colleagues sort of kind of how challenging and frustrating it can be, both for the clinical teams and moreover for the families. For today's webinar, I'd like to focus on 3 broad topics. One is advances in early detection. The second is thinking about what is our current capacity to diagnose autism earlier. And finally, to talk a little bit more about a lifespan perspective in timely diagnosis. So let's start with early detection. So, as I commented, a lot of this work does focus on infants at risk on the basis of having positive family histories. So these are generally younger siblings of children who have autism, identified through the clinic. There are a number of groups who are following these infants starting at 6 months of age or younger. This approach of working with family members, particularly siblings, has been adopted in other areas of development and mental health. But it's particularly helpful in autism because, it is a condition that we can be pretty confident about diagnosis at an early stage. So we can genuinely follow a group of infants for a few years and be able to map our early observations and parents' observations onto the later diagnosis. The other exciting opportunity, of course, is the chance to work directly with these infants with early signs and think about what we might be able to develop and offer in terms of interventions. And this genuinely is a high-risk group. A number of research groups that have followed these younger siblings pulled together their experience a few years ago and found that the overall rate of recurrence was close to 1 in 5, so 18.7%, higher when the older child is, higher when the younger sibling is male, and also, not surprisingly, higher when there are already more than one affected child in the family. It's interesting that there have been a number of community-based or epidemiologic studies looking at recurrence since then, and the findings are actually a lot more variable. And both in the US and Scandinavia, some studies actually put the recurrence risk at closer to 10%, despite the overall increase in prevalence. So this is another question mark in the autism field, and I think at this point it's probably most appropriate to suggest that the recurrence risk is about 10 to 20%. A lot of the findings that I'll be discussing today come from a Canadian study working with younger siblings that's been ongoing for the past 15 years. Has been a collaboration of a group in Toronto led by Jessica Bryan and Wendy Roberts, in Halifax led by Isabel Smith and Susan Bryson, in Hamilton, formerly myself and Peter Zetmari. Now I'm leading a site in Edmonton, and Peter is in Toronto. And we've had other wonderful colleagues, including Caroline Roncada, Nancy Garan, Lori Sacre, Vicky Armstrong in Halifax. So over time, we've worked with just under 500 younger siblings of children with autism. We also work with a group of infants who don't have a positive family history, just to provide a reference point as a group of lower risk infants. We see these children every 6 months, starting at the age of 6 months, looking at early behavioral signs, their language and cognitive development, aspects of their attention and emotion regulation. And then all of those infants at the age of 3 are seen by an experienced clinician who hasn't met the family before, hasn't reviewed the file, and comes up with an independent judgment about whether they have a diagnosis of autism or not. However, because this is a diagnosis and a group of families that we've had certainly a strong clinical interest, and certainly families deserve a diagnosis as early as possible. Even prior to that blind 3-year assessment, we've offered clinical diagnoses along the way, which has kind of allowed us to track kind of our own ability to recognize the diagnosis at an early stage, and also to some extent family experience sort of going through that process. When we track early behavioral signs, we do it in a number of ways. One of these is by sitting down and playing with the child using an observational schedule that was developed by Susan Bryson and the team. And it includes a number of observations that cross social communication, repetitive interests in play, also aspects of motor development, attention, imitation, sort of early play skills. These are the kinds of observations that all of you would think about considering based on experience with older preschools with autism, and it's just given us a consistent way of tracking these younger infants. So based on this observational scale, we've been able to identify a handful of behaviors that as early as 12 months are actually quite predictive of autism. And the way we've looked at this is by comparing the high-risk infants that go on to develop a diagnosis of autism, and compare the frequency of those behaviors in infants who develop autism to the siblings who don't end up developing autism, and also the low-risk infants. So each of these behaviors distinguishes the autism group from the non-diagnosed groups. And that is, do the kids look up and orient when their name is called? Do they participate in back and forth babbling? Do they make eye contact consistently? And interestingly, this is an item where we see a gradient across these 3 groups, that the autism group is least likely to make consistent eye contact. But it's interesting that the other siblings, even those who don't have autism, also are less likely to be making consistent eye contact. And although one might think that this is because we have sort of an expectation that younger siblings may be at higher risk of early signs of autism, this remains true even if we code the videos without knowing who is who. So there does seem to be something about familial risk that is associated with social differences even among these younger siblings who don't develop autism. Similarly, displaying social interest and sharing positive emotion is characteristic of autism, but also something that occurs as a gradient across the 3 groups, and likewise social referencing. So the degree to which infants try to draw their parents or the examiner's attention to other things in the room, like toys that they're playing with. So those are signs in the social domain, and then there are also a number of behaviors in more of the interest and repetitive behaviors domain. So even at 12 months, we see infants who have a lot of difficulty with transitioning between activities. They get stuck on playing with a particular toy. We see a typical sensory exploration behavior, particularly tactile interests and sort of intensely inspecting toys, so kind of in the visual domain. And we even see some infants who just are not engaged in the environment. So this engagement of attention item really refers to what extent the infants just naturally visually explore the environment. And there are some infants with autism who are so preoccupied or focused on a particular object that they seem less aware of other things going on. So that's sort of what we can do in terms of our own observation. But in recent years, we've recognized that it's really important to continue to emphasize the value of what parents, of the insights of parents and what they bring to the conversation. I think with the focus on prospective studies of at-risk infants, we've kind of left, to some extent, parent concerns sort of as a bit more secondary, because there was a concern that because parent concerns were were always in retrospect. So what was published previously was really asking parents when they came into the clinic what they recalled about what their infants were like when they were a year old. And I mean, like for all of us, it's difficult to remember all those details, and to some extent it may be filtered through the later experience with the diagnosis. But because we're following these young infants along, of course, we're speaking to parents along the way. And as it turns out, not surprisingly, the parents are actually extremely skilled in recognizing these behaviors independent of our visits. And in fact, when we look at what parents have to say over time, sort of as we have a chance to get to know these families and work with the infants, parents are also identifying differences related to social and communication development by 12 to 15 months and by 18 months in terms of some of these repetitive behaviors and interests. And interestingly, parents are also recognizing differences in developmental domains that aren't specific to autism, but are also predictive of autism. So parents describe concerns in their infants even as early as 6 months in terms of their motor control, in terms of their sensory interest and regulation, and by 9 months in terms of some of the sensory-oriented play. Likewise, we've developed a parent screening analog or a parent questionnaire analog of our observational scale. And similar to what parents described in an open-ended discussion, when they complete this questionnaire that sort of has very similar information as on our observational scale, parent reports on these questionnaires are actually extremely informative. In fact, when we include items that relate to motor development, sensory regulation, typical play, parents are actually discriminating between infants who go on to develop autism from those who don't as early as 6 to 9 months. And if we look at the 6-month data, the classification based on the sensitivity and specificity is actually quite promising. I mean, the main caveat is that this is a group of younger siblings, but we're really interested in taking this out into the community and seeing whether it might be informative even for infants who don't have a positive family history. So there are a number of exciting new directions, in particular technology-based biomarkers that might someday be able to complement what we can hear about from parents and observe behaviorally. There's been a lot of work looking at eye tracking as a way to more systematically track what children are orienting to and paying attention to. There's been interest in sort of kind of brain function using evoked responses, particularly to faces and other social information. As I mentioned, that there's been some interesting work that's coming out of the U.S. Led by Joe Piven at the University of North Carolina, and finding that both in terms of brain volume and measures of both functional and structural brain connectivity, there may actually be an autism signature that's recognizable as early as 6 months. And although I won't talk about it in detail today, there's a lot of exciting work, led by a Canadian group, in particular Steve Shearer in Toronto, looking at the genetic architecture of autism, and certainly these genetic measures could be identified sort of, very early in infancy, and may also kind of allow us to be identifying kids even pre-symptomatically, sort of based on their risk profile. The fact that we've been following these younger infants actually has really stimulated a lot of work looking at possible interventions that would be relevant to autism but more appropriate developmentally for young infants and toddlers. And there are actually a number of evidence-based interventions now, models supported by clinical trials, including a new model of the social ABCs developed by Susan Bryson and Jessica Bryan in Canada. These 4 models are actually currently being piloted as part of an early intervention initiative in Ontario. Very exciting, community-based young toddlers with early signs of autism being offered these intervention models. And again, emphasizing that there is actually a lot at stake, that identifying these early signs could actually lead to the participation intervention, which could ultimately significantly improve outcomes. There certainly are a number of caveats. As I mentioned, a lot of this work focuses on younger siblings, and we need to learn more about whether these sorts of measures would be informative in the general community. These technology-based measures really remain to be assessed outside of a research context. I mean, certainly it's hard to imagine sort of moving neuroimaging into the general pediatric clinic. Certainly resource and constraints and just sort of the burden on infants and parents. I think we would have to use that kind of technology pretty selectively. Conversely, thinking about eye tracking, that kind of capacity is probably could be built into the next generation of tablets, and it's less difficult to imagine a day where at the same time we're asking parents to describe the behaviors that they're seeing at home, that maybe we would actually have infants play a game on an iPad and see sort of what catches their attention, and whether their interest in social versus kind of non-social stimuli might actually help us kind of modify our expectation around autism risk. And then, as I commented, there are a number of clinical and ethical issues related to pre-symptomatic detection. And although on one hand there's the potential of offering sort of kind of pre-symptomatic intervention, kind of anticipating that there are some infants based on early markers that may benefit from specific attention to helping them be flexible, to sort of helping them orient to social kinds of experiences. On the other hand, the burden on parents to be thinking about autism in a situation where their infant isn't yet showing symptoms, and the impact that could have long term, I think, is something worth considering. Of course, we also have to consider the health system issues. How we currently struggle with supporting the children and families that we identify through the usual clinical process. What are the implications if we start to move early detection to even a pre-symptomatic situation? The truth is, a lot of this work around early detection, the way to translate it and get it out into the community is to actually come up with some sort of measure that parents can do in the waiting room. And so really a lot of the end game here is about distilling some of these findings into specific screening tools. But as I commented, there's already a lot of controversy around the current autism screens that we have. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. There are a number of screens out there. Perhaps the exemplar to talk about, just for illustration, is the modified checklist for autism in toddlers. It's probably the screen that's been assessed most extensively in community contexts. It's been translated into multiple languages. It's available for free download online. There's a kind of an app that one can do on a tablet, so just sort of facilitating parents to do that as part of within a busy clinical practice. It's gone through a number of iterations. The current version is 20 items. The wording's a bit simpler than the previous version. That you may be aware that the MCHAT is actually a two-stage screen, starting with a questionnaire followed up by an interview. But even that is a bit more streamlined now, where the interview is reserved for kids with sort of a moderate number of risk markers identified through the parent questionnaire. Bottom line is that the most recent research suggests that if the kids are positive on the MCHAT and they're referred in for evaluation, almost half of them will end up having a confirmed diagnosis of autism. And even among the 50% who don't, the large majority of those kids will end up with another developmental diagnosis, language delay, mild global delay. So the kids that get identified through the MCHAT, they seem like a reasonable group to come to attention and have more specialized assessment. It's important to emphasize that one of the major limitations of the MCHAT research as a whole is that the focus really is on screen-positive kids, and there generally has not been sort of this independent effort to identify autism among the screen-negative kids. There's another screen called the Infant-Toddler Checklist, where the screening research has actually involved surveillance for autism in the entire community where the screening's taken place, and the sensitivity in that measure is actually over 90%, although a second level interactive screen is necessary to decide sort of who is appropriate to bring in for a more comprehensive assessment. So we have screens that are pretty accurate and can be administered as early as about 18 months of age. So there are a number of opinions, and this is an ongoing conversation. So I was part of a a best practice consensus group a few years ago, bringing together a number of people in North America, sort of in the field, sort of focused on early diagnosis. And the consensus among that group of clinicians and researchers was that there are certainly factors both in favor of screening and also potential barriers and challenges. In favor of screening are the fact that we do actually have screens with decent classification properties. They're pretty accurate. They do identify the right kids. And for both the infant toddler checklist and the MCHAT, there's good research suggesting that by doing the questionnaire, kids will be more consistently identified and identified at an earlier stage. And so that it's not that parents don't recognize concerns, but rather that the screening tool provides a bit more of a common vocabulary for clinicians and parents, and it becomes a bit more of a conversation opener, and becomes a more even playing field for parents who are less comfortable bringing up these concerns, or who may not be as familiar with some of the details of what might get the clinician's attention. And as I commented, that the intervention field is genuinely starting to catch up to the availability of screens, and although these types of toddler interventions are not available in every community, the capacity is increasing, and we've got some exciting translation and dissemination of these interventions into the community. There's no question that there are some challenges as well in terms of time and resources. Certainly in the States, reimbursement is a question, and even in Canada, busy family physicians and community pediatricians thinking about how to incorporate these screens into their busy practices is something that we still need to grapple with. You may have noticed on the MCHAT slide that it's only about 2/3 of the kids that were screen positive actually were seen for assessment. So there is a phenomena that I think is not fully understood at this point, that some families decide not to pursue further assessment, and I think some clinicians also decide that despite the screen, that the further assessment isn't warranted. And of course, there's concerns about system capacity as well. But there are a number of people that feel that on balance, given the accuracy of the screens, the potential for early intervention, and the preference of families, that the weight of evidence would suggest that screening could be beneficial. As I commented, the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force took a very different stance, that even though they acknowledged that the screens are relatively accurate, they really felt that there wasn't sufficient evidence of screening, really as an intervention, sort of as an intervention that improves long-term outcomes, based on randomized controlled trials. So we are at a bit of a crossroads, and I think the crux of the issue is what constitutes benefit of screening. Traditionally, we tend to think about screening as a means of improving health outcomes. So one thing I think as a community that we need to grapple with is, while we're waiting for that data, do we believe that early diagnosis is of intrinsic value to families? Is early diagnosis in and of itself, even though we may not have the sufficient data to know whether starting intervention at 1.5 years versus 2.5, and whether starting at 1.5 years because of a screen versus a community pediatrician identifying autism, even if we don't have answers to those questions, is early diagnosis still of intrinsic value, and can screening help us get there? The truth is, in Canada, we have a very rich history of working in partnership with community physicians, both family physicians and pediatricians, and an emphasis on surveillance. Screening tools could help inform surveillance, could help form judgment that's based on ongoing relationship with families, gathering information over time. So is there kind of middle ground where screens could be used to inform clinical decision-making rather than simply sort of basing the entire referral decision on the score on the screen? More broadly, how do we partner with community healthcare providers? Some research that's been done, including by Angie Ick, who's a developmental pediatrician currently doing her PhD at UBC, asking the question of what are community pediatricians looking for in a screen, and sort of what might hold them back from screening. And their concerns are much more about the health system than the properties of the screen per se. How long are kids going to have to wait? Are the teams prepared prepared to work with these kids and provide timely service, and are these kids going to access intervention? So we really do need a Made in Canada approach. But I think given that it's still an open question, there is a real opportunity to bridge across these different perspectives rather than sort of kind of remain in a sort of a polarized discussion where we have a public health discussion that's focused exclusively on long-term randomized controlled trials, and we have sort of this clinical perspective that for some people screening is good even though we don't have the answers to these questions. Can we find some middle ground? So this might actually be a natural time to take a break for a couple questions. Lots of kind of contentious issues, and really interested in people's questions and comments. We should probably limit to 2 or 3 just so we have time to get through the other material, but certainly interested in your comments.
All right, sounds good. So there have been a couple of questions come in, and Gail, if you had any comments that you wanted to add at this point, anything that comes to your mind as well, we'll certainly welcome any comments from you as well. But the first question that came in fairly early was from Anita, and she was just wondering about females versus males with ASD, and do females present differently in any key ways that you can identify?
It's a great question. You know, it's something that's evolving in the field. Historically, the girls with autism tended to have more severe symptoms and more severe intellectual delay, so that if we looked at children who had significant intellectual disability, there was much more of an even number of girls and boys, whereas if we looked at kids, you know, with sort of that kind of the Asperger profile who are highly verbal and average IQs, there tended to be many more boys compared to girls. That's actually starting to change. That in the most recent longitudinal cohorts, the differences in IQ are actually much smaller, and differences in symptoms are actually much more variable, and to some extent reflect social differences in boys and girls more generally, rather than being related to autism. It's also interesting that in some of the epidemiologic research, it seems like if we look at the agreement between clinical diagnosis and an independent file review, sort of potentially identifying kids that were missed by the clinical referral process, it seems that older girls are more likely to be missed. Again, because we sort of have this expectation that the autism is more common in boys, and also there may be genuine differences in social behavior in girls that kind of mask some of the autism symptoms. So it's an interesting question that continues to evolve. I think the bottom line is that the differences are less profound than previously, and we're certainly seeing a lot more higher functioning girls, even if we end up picking them up later.
Thank you very much for that. Gail, any comments from you at this point?
Well, I think as one of Lonnie's colleagues who participates in the diagnostic clinics at the Glenrose, I struggle with this ethical question about our capacity, where we know that kids and families are waiting to get in for a diagnosis that will then inform their ability to access more specialized services. My question is, why can't they get services based on functional needs? And I know it's the capacity question again, but it really is an ethical dilemma.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and I think it's an ongoing discussion for our community. The truth is, as we push the boundaries around early diagnosis, there's no question that there will be a period of time between where the symptoms are obvious to the clinicians and the parents, but there's still some ambiguity about diagnosis. And really, if we want kids to benefit from these really early intervention programs, we have to sort of be comfortable moving to this at-risk concept, and as you say, sort of offer interventions based on functional needs. I think, as you say, one can make that argument for older kids as well. I think the capacity issue is probably not just about numbers, but also about us reflecting on sort of how we go about the process of diagnosis. And there's certainly a lot of exciting interventions across the country looking at more flexible approaches to assessment, and really building capacity in the community rather than seeing autism necessarily as a tertiary level diagnosis. So I think that, in addressing the issue that you're raising, I think we both need to be more flexible and strong advocates of this functional approach, and at the same time, I think probably become more efficient and inclusive about sort of how we build the diagnostic system.
I think we have that exact same conversation previously in many webinars that Gail has been a part, or Dr. Andrews has been a part of, around fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that whole concept of screening and then challenges in resources to diagnose and then subsequently treatment opportunities as well. It's very much the similar issue there. We did have another comment come in from Cosmin, who's asking if you studied the model in Saskatchewan at all. She says in Saskatchewan there's a screening tool for ASD based on referral or self-referral that's followed by full assessment with ADI, ADOS, etc. And if red flags, then for ASD identified. She says services are provided if screened in. I'm just wondering if you're familiar, with the model right next door in the province right next door.
Honestly, I'm not familiar with the exact model or sort of what screening tool they're using. I happened to be visiting Saskatoon, I think in March or April, to do to kind of have a visit and do ground. So I'll look forward to hearing about it then. There's some interesting work in Calgary as well, sort of using an interactive screen to kind of streamline the referral process. I'm hesitant to comment on the Saskatoon model. I think it's an interesting question about whether one offers services based on screen. And I think there are probably merits and downsides, both in terms of kind of reaching a larger group of kids earlier based on symptoms, along the lines of what Gail is suggesting, and yet also recognizing that even something like the MCHAT, a positive screen, doesn't necessarily indicate autism, but may indicate sort of a much broader range of developmental difference. And screens in the end are probably are primarily designed to assign risk and identify kids in need of further assessment. I think practically, I would imagine that any access to intervention based on screening would have to be followed by some sort of functional assessment to understand what that child's needs are. But it sounds very promising, the idea of using a screen to kind of both for service planning as well as kind of streamlining the referral and assessment process. So I wish I could answer the question, but I look forward to hearing about it more soon.
She did follow up with a comment that the screening tool they use is mostly the ASRS. I'm not sure exactly what that acronym stands for.
Yeah, interesting. I have to say I'm not familiar with the ASRS. Maybe I can follow. I'm happy to follow up with that person offline, and maybe we can end up connecting kind of when I'm in Saskatchewan.
Well, I believe they are in Saskatoon, so when you go there for a visit, perhaps there will be an opportunity to connect.
Terrific, thank you.
Yeah, so maybe we can again, any more questions or comments, or especially comments, sharing what it is you're doing in your region regarding screening tools or any other processes that you have in place related to this. Please do share them in the comment box. But for now, we'll go back to Dr. Zwagenbaum to continue on with the presentation.
Okay, that's great. So just briefly, I'd like to talk a little bit about our experience in assessing and diagnosing these at-risk infants. So, because I think it's relevant in terms of when we think about the possibility of implementing screening. If we bring these 18 and 24-month-olds into the clinic, given that our experience tends to be with somewhat older kids, are we going to be, how certain are we going to be about the diagnosis when we see them the first time? And how early can we diagnose it? How far can we sort of push the envelope before we start to get into an area of greater uncertainty? As I commented earlier, there's actually lots of data that suggests that certainly at age 2, experienced clinicians are really quite confident and accurate in their diagnoses. And for the most part, diagnoses that are established at age 2 would be confirmed a year or 2 later, even if the child was seen independently. In the old era of PDD and OS, there was a bit more variability, not surprisingly, because these are kids who would be sort of closer to the diagnostic boundary. There's less research on stability of autism diagnosis before 2 years of age, but the research that's been done suggests that the stability is just as good. So we're looking at 80 to 90%. I want to draw, though, sort of a contrast between sort of kids that are clinically referred versus the younger siblings that we follow through these high-risk studies. So our experience, at least at the Glenrose, and chatting with colleagues in other centers, I think has been similar, that we may feel relatively confident when we see 18-month and 24-month-olds coming in, but often those kids are pretty severely affected. For them to get flagged in the community and make their way through the intake process at a rehab hospital, often these are kids with pretty textbook presentations. And one wonders whether there are a group of kids in the community who have autism but may not be coming to attention. So when we look at the stability of our diagnoses, it's only the kids that make it in, and maybe only the kids that are more severely affected. Although children with autism identified through these sibling studies are not necessarily fully representative of all kids with autism, the truth is we're seeing all these infants regardless of the severity of their symptoms. And in a sense, it gives us this opportunity to kind of check out our skills and comfort in assessing children even with very mild symptoms, and looking both at the stability of diagnosis and, frankly, the timing of diagnosis. At what point does it become sufficiently evident to us where we're confident in making a diagnosis? So that's what we did with this group of younger siblings. We followed them starting at 6 months of age. For the most part, the first visit, what we were seriously considering a diagnosis, was the 18-month visit. We didn't have a standard visit at 15 months, and maybe if we had, we would have been thinking about diagnosis then. But so first, of this group that were followed to 24 months, about 15% were given a clinical diagnosis at that stage, and over 90% of those diagnoses were confirmed by a different clinician sort of assessing the children without knowing the previous diagnosis. So that's pretty stable. And that actually includes over 80% of the children that were diagnosed at 18 months. But we wondered, that's one group of kids, but what about the kids that were diagnosed later? Are there kids that kind of flew under our radar at 24 months? And what factors would be associated with being picked up at 24 months or kind of not being picked up at 24 months? And this is work that's been published both by our group and by a consortium of groups that we contributed to, and the story is very similar. So two things to flag on this slide. So first of all, although we identified a fair number of kids by the age of 2 years, so that was 15% of the total sibling sample, there are a heck of a lot of kids that did actually fly under our radar and received a diagnosis for the first time at age 3. It was actually almost half of all the kids who had a diagnosis by age 3. And if you compare the kids who were diagnosed at age 3 with the ones that were diagnosed earlier, in terms of how they looked at age 2, there were some real differences. So the Mullen is a general developmental assessment that is based on T-scores. So a T-score of 50 is the same as a standard score of 100. So a standard score of a T-score of 50 is kind of like an average level of development. So you can see here that across developmental domains, you see that these later diagnosed kids had pretty average development. I mean, they were verbal, they had sort of relatively typical language, kind of typical levels of expressive and receptive skills, in contrast to the kids who were diagnosed earlier who did have significant language and intellectual delays. Similarly, the kids who were diagnosed later did not have the same degree of adaptive impairments. Interestingly, the kids who were diagnosed later, even at 2 years, had ASD symptoms. So this ADOS severity score of 4 is kind of right at the margin between mild ASD and non-ASD, which suggests that about half of these kids who were not diagnosed at 2 actually had ADOS scores within the ASD range. But I have to say, we see a fair number of kids within the sibling sample that score above the ASD range, even when we're not convinced that they actually have a clinical diagnosis. So it's a real dilemma. These kids are missed, and they genuinely look different. They have milder symptoms and less severe delays, which is essentially what's said here. So the truth is, if these kids have been identified and screened and brought in, they would not necessarily have scored high on the ADOS. The experienced clinical team would not necessarily have been convinced that that child had autism, and those diagnoses would tend to be a bit later. Of course, if the clinic had a policy that you only get one visit and sort of one opportunity for diagnosis, then those kids would be lost sort of into school age. So it really does kind of raise questions about when kids come in for an initial assessment and there's ambiguity in terms of the finding, the importance of flexibility of reassessment, particularly when there are ongoing concerns. it also, so we've agonized over this. So you can imagine that we're a group that's very much oriented to early diagnosis, and we sort of started this research really thinking that if we could only spend time with parents, talking to them and playing with the kids, that we would be able to diagnose all these kids by 12 or 18 months. So even with experience and even with sort of pretty comprehensive assessments, so these kids are kind of under the microscope, almost half of the kids were diagnosed past age 2. But, it does raise the question, is this so unique to autism? We were pretty comfortable with the idea that kids, for instance, with ADHD will kind of have sort of early development that is suggestive of the diagnosis. They may be, challenging behaviors, more accident prone, higher activity level, but they're not necessarily going to be diagnosed with ADHD at 2 or 3 years old, but rather not until they're in the school system and show more significant functional impairments. So it does raise this question of if you have autism, do you always have autism, or is it sort of based both on symptoms and functional impairment? And is it possible to have autism symptoms without a diagnosis, which really does come back to Gail's question about maybe we should be more flexible about offering interventions, even during this interval where behavior is evident but diagnosis isn't so evident. Okay, so interesting points there. I have a couple more slides on sort of talking about older individuals. Maybe for time I might move to that and then sort of save a bit of time for discussion both on this question of timing of diagnosis and also sort of moving that issue sort of into school age and even adulthood. So as I commented, I think a lot of us really struggle with school age diagnosis. I'm fortunate at the Glenrose, along with Gail, to have a chance to work both in the preschool clinic and the school age clinic. And they're both wonderful teams, but man, the school age clinics are so much more difficult. The kids who come in have a lot of challenges behind them. They don't have straightforward presentations. I'm going to skip that slide. It just sort of makes the point that historically these kids with average intellectual ability tend to get diagnosed not at 3 or 4, but actually at 9 or 10 years old. The reality is that when we're thinking about our assessment of autism, we're focused on the DSM and sort of thinking about core symptoms. But particularly school-age kids have had the experience in the school system dealing with academic stressors, social stressors, sort of frustration with their own symptoms, and that kind of translates into a lot of behavioral difficulty, which is often what brings these kids to attention sort of once they're in the school system. So when we see kids who are referred, it's just as likely to be because of oppositional behavior and just being inflexible rather because of people recognizing core communication and social difficulties. And that these are kids that teachers and other frontline people find very frustrating to work with. Parents have this kind of agonizing process of sort of not getting answers, and it's just a lot more complicated. I want to flag as well that even though we've seen a lot of the quality and comprehensiveness of assessment in school age clinics is really quite impressive across the country, even kind of our gold standard ADOS does not perform all that well in this mixed group of school age kids who come in with developmental and mental health issues. So a referral clinic in Cincinnati looked at the accuracy of the ADOS relative to clinical diagnosis of autism. The bottom line is that ADOS was very sensitive, but actually not terribly specific. So you could have a depressed kid, you could have an oppositional kid who scored high on the ADOS for other reasons, and an experienced clinician will be able to sort of recognize those subtle differences, but you can't rely on the scores, and it just sort of puts the emphasis back on the expertise and the judgment of the clinician and the team, and just emphasizes that this is not a straightforward process. At the Glenrose, we've been really excited to work in partnership with a primary care network and 2 developmental psychiatrists from the UK, with some support from a private foundation, the Cine Family Foundation in Calgary, to establish an adult assessment and follow-up clinic. But it's really sort of opened our eyes in terms of the additional challenges that adults face. So the reality is that when we talk about transition to adulthood in autism, there's not much of a service system to transition to, and it's pretty fragmented. Pretty limited pool of experienced diagnosticians. we're so fortunate to be working with these psychiatrists. There's certainly a lot of adult psychiatrists that are less familiar with differential diagnosis and autism. Certainly our own team of developmental pediatricians is willing to kind of learn more, but the truth is that these are individuals that have even more life experience behind them. The differential diagnoses in terms of things like personality disorders and schizophrenia and mood disorders is just fundamentally different than what we tend to be thinking about in younger kids. No question that if someone makes it to adulthood without an ASD diagnosis, there's a certain level of complexity. But there's also a lot at stake for these adults, not only in terms of accessing supports and services, but for a lot of adults, it becomes a real community for them. Sort of being able to connect with like-minded people, develop insights about themselves, and develop a self-identity that's actually positively oriented around their unique way of seeing the world. So it is something that we absolutely need to develop, but it's such a rudimentary stage right now, and just our efforts to increase early diagnosis are not necessarily going to benefit this older group. So just a brief summary, and then glad to open it up for discussion again. We're learning a lot about early markers of autism, and I see some exciting potential to even combine what parents have to say, our own observations, and even some biomarkers to continue pushing the boundaries of early diagnosis. Translation into clinical practice will have to take account of broader health systems, the capacity issue that Gail described, and also just thinking more creatively about diagnostic models. Because clearly it's not going to be one size fits all. And then we do need to be thinking more about this concept of timely diagnosis, because the notion of a trickle down from early diagnosis is probably just not going to pan out. And we really need to be building capacity independently for school age and adult diagnosis, while at the same time we're thinking about these infants and toddlers. And likewise building the service system for that older group. So thank you. I mean, this is certainly a work of a team. I talked a little bit about our key investigators on the sibling research program, wonderful research and clinical staff, great support from a number of groups, including CIHR, NeuroDevNet, Brain Canada, Azrieli Foundation, Autism Speech, and also our local supporters, including the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation. So thanks very much for your interest. It's been the last question period, excellent points, and we do have a few minutes, so looking forward to your further comments and questions.
All right, thank you for a great presentation. We did have a few questions regarding the slides. I know you were going to embed a video at one point that you didn't end up doing. I know the slides that you sent to Anne, are we able to share those with the audience? We did have a few questions about that.
Yes, you are welcome to share those with the audience.
Thank you very much for that. The first question that came in, and this one is riddled with acronyms, so hopefully you will know what they mean. Otherwise, we'll ask Robin to provide some clarification.
I'm 0 for 1 so far.
She's asking if you know about the ESAC, and if you have any thoughts about using that instead of the ITC or the MCHAT.
ESAC, so it's a screening tool. I think I might, but if the person who asked could give the full name, maybe that would ring a bell. But I mean, I think that, obviously, given that I'm not super familiar with it, I think it's worth acknowledging that there are, maybe this third generation of autism screening tools that are starting to be reported. There are some great options that are out there. I'm not aware of any studies that have really compared them head-to-head, so it becomes an issue of classification accuracy and also the context in which they're used. So I think the decision about what screening tools to use is probably kind of multifaceted. So my long-winded way of avoiding that, I think I may not be, unless we have the exact the name of this tool, it doesn't sort of come immediately to mind.
She did follow up and say it's the Early Signs of Autism and Communication Disorders by Weatherby.
Okay. So, I'm familiar with the SORF, which is the second level screen that was developed by Weatherby to follow up on kids that were positive on the ITC. I think I have actually come across the paper that describes the early signs of autism, the ECAC. I don't know that the research is as extensive as with the ITC, and which is also from Weatherby, and with the MCHAT, but I seem to recall that it was also promising. So again, I think there are probably more sort of big picture questions about the screens that sort of, in some ways, sort of supersede the question of whether this screen is necessarily better than that screen or vice versa.
All right. The next question came in from Carla, and she says, in your experience, are cognitive and speech language assessments required or only recommended as part of a comprehensive assessment for ASD in addition to the ADI and ADOS?
So these are interesting and contentious issues, and there's currently an effort through the Public Health Agency of Canada to develop kind of best practice standards that would be applicable across the range of contexts across Canada. In print, I would personally say that the three broad kind of areas of information that are needed to make a diagnosis are a developmental history, including diagnostic history, an interactive assessment, and information about the child's developmental status. The way that's operationalized in different communities, I think, might vary. I think one might argue that if having some information about the child's intellectual ability, some information about the child's language ability, but not necessarily sort of contained within the same same multidisciplinary assessment. So there's certainly a lot of programs that would have that information gathered in the community. The question of sort of how to time the most comprehensive assessments, whether all that information is needed at the point of diagnosis, particularly for a child who has clear language impairments. It's interesting that with the shift to DSM-5, the language delay as well as intellectual delay is not a cardinal diagnostic symptom, but rather is important as developmental context for understanding the other symptoms, particularly impairments in communication. So in principle, having a language and intellectual assessment is important in informing the diagnosis. The truth is, if you have a child who has, particularly an older child who has learning issues, but clearly has intellectual abilities that allow them to function day to day, have fluent speech. I think that it's open to debate whether one needs a comprehensive language assessment in order to make the diagnosis. To inform treatment, absolutely, but as we grapple with the issue of the service capacity and availability of diagnostic teams, particularly sort of as we move the diagnosis in the community, I do think we're going to have to grapple with this and come to a consensus about, what is sort of at the core of what is sufficient data to establish a diagnosis and what additional data is needed to inform treatment. So I think that is an ongoing conversation, and I think that there's probably some room for flexibility, probably more room for flexibility than we've had historically.
We do have one more question from that we'll take from Anita, and then maybe we'll just get hear if Gail has some comments to add to the conversation. But the question from Anita is in regards to orienting to name or eye contact. She's asking, is it true that children with ASD can do those things inconsistently? So in other words, if a child orients inconsistently, is that a flag or not?
So great question. So the answer is yes, it is a flag. And what we've learned in working with these at-risk infants is that these are not sort of like one extreme or another. There are actually lots of kids who end up having a diagnosis of autism where it's inconsistent, it varies by the person, it varies by sort of how, what's going on around the child. Are they preoccupied with a toy? Are they sort of in a dysregulated state? And it's also not, no one symptom either makes or breaks a diagnosis. We see some kids who don't end up having a diagnosis of autism who have these features. We have other kids who do end up having a diagnosis where it's subtle or inconsistent. So it's really the sort of the range of behavioral features and how they come together, rather than hanging one's hat on sort of any one feature. And the flip side is one cannot exclude a diagnosis just because the child is responding or making eye contact. So great question, and it does sort of highlight the challenges of really early diagnosis, because there is some overlap in terms of the behaviors of kids who end up having autism versus kids who don't end up having autism.
So what we usually do at this point was just hand it over to you, Dr. Zwagenbaum, just for any final closing comments that you'd like to leave the audience with. If there's any sort of research that's about to be groundbreaking research that you're about to publish anytime soon, if there's anything new coming out and where people can find it, anything you'd like to leave the audience with before we wrap up.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I think this is just, it's been an incredibly gratifying and humbling experience working with these younger infants and also working in the clinic, because the more we think we know, the more we recognize that this is challenging clinical work, and at either end of the developmental continuum, either the really young kids or the really older kids, it does take the support of a team. It takes, it's important to be able to feel comfortable with acknowledging uncertainty, and really thinking about those community partnerships in sort of sharing some of that responsibility for the diagnostic work. There are some, there's definitely exciting work that's sort of on the verge of publication, particularly around biomarkers, whether it's genetics, neuroimaging, also this ERP work. But lots of unanswered questions about sort of what are going to be the implications for practice. So this is like yet another example in our field where our clinical and ethical discussions need to catch up with the technology. But I think overall it's a very kind of positive and optimistic time in terms of potential for earlier diagnosis and also the interventions that are available in the community. And very much kind of the work of Canadians is at the forefront. And again, I want to acknowledge my partners both locally and also in Halifax, Toronto, and Hamilton. It's been a fabulous experience, and it's been a real education. So I've appreciated the opportunity to share that, and look forward to ongoing conversations through CAPC.
If people wanted to get in touch with you following this for any follow-up questions, what would be the best way people get in touch with you?
People are welcome to contact me. There aren't a whole lot of Zwagenbaums out there, so I'm pretty easy to find through the university or hospital, and you're certainly welcome to share my email, Doug.
All right, sounds good. So we will share your contact or your email based on the Knowledge Exchange Network where we post the recording, etc., and people can get in touch there. All right, so thank you. So I think with that, we'll wrap it up. I mean, great presentation. As autism in general is a topic of great interest in the community, and you really brought some really fantastic information. You're such a recognized name across Canada in this area, so we really appreciate you joining us today.
Okay, thanks so much, and thanks everyone for being on the webinar.
All right, so we do our webinars every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and we do record the entire session, so if there's anything that you missed here, you can go to the Knowledge Exchange Network and we'll set out the fact. It's where you can participate live with the questions and conversations that really enrich the discussion with that recording, and the slides, as we mentioned, will be available on the Knowledge Exchange Network. Tomorrow, on Thursday, January 26th, we will have part 4 of our special 6-part series, Life with a Preterm Baby, that we're doing in collaboration with the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation and sponsored by Prolact Bioscience. Part 4 is titled Feeding Your Baby in the NICU, and we'll be welcoming Tammy McBride from Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto and Kate Robinson from Sunnybrook Health Centre, also in Toronto, who will share information about feeding babies in the NICU and preparing for discharge home. We'll talk about topics such as transitioning to oral feeding, breastfeeding after discharge, and many other questions that are of interest to clinicians and caregivers in the NICU, but also the focus of this 6-part series is information for parents of premature infants as well. But next week, on February 1st, a topic very much of interest to those of you who participated today, we'll be having a presentation on data collection in the ambulatory and community-based rehabilitation services sector, where we will be hearing from some of the folks within the CAPC community who have led the work to develop our pediatric rehabilitation reporting system. CM Naveed from CAPC's Canadian Pediatric Decision Support Network, Sonia Pagura from Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital, and Dorothy Harvey from the Niagara Children's Centre will share with us some of their experiences in addressing the challenges of collecting data in the ambulatory and community-based rehab setting, being PERS, the Pediatric Rehabilitation Reporting System, represents our approach to addressing some of those challenges and developing a support system to support data-driven improvements in rehabilitation service delivery. So it'll be a great opportunity, if you've heard of PERS, and I'm sure many of you have, to find out what they're up to now, where the project is at, and just to talk about and to share your thoughts and experiences with attempting to collect and compare and benchmark across the rehabilitation services sector. So as always, some great stuff coming up. Thanks again to Dr. Zwagenbaum and to Dr. Andrew. She did have some computer trouble. She left me some comments. I wasn't able to really contribute as she always does, but I'm sure she will be back on our next rehab webinar as well. So we hope to see everyone back here either tomorrow for Life with a Preterm Baby or next week for next CAPC Presents. Bye, everyone.
Great. Thanks again.